This is the California Liberty Project podcast.
Welcome back to the California Liberty Project podcast. My name is Greg, and once again, thank you all for being here today. Make sure to go to Google, Apple, Spotify, follow, give us a review, do whatever you have to do. We really appreciate that. Helps things with the algorithm, helps the podcast grow so more people can hear the great guests that we're bringing to you on California Liberty Project. So today I've got two guests actually, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. My guests today are Kerry Baldwin and Gregory Baus. And they have a podcast. It's called the Reformed Libertarians podcast. It's another relatively new podcast. You should definitely check it out on all podcatchers. And Kerry is also on the Dare to Think podcast through Mere Liberty. And I want to welcome both of you to the podcast here today. And thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So would each of you give us just a really quick kind of background or introduction to yourselves, as far as your work and what it is that you do in the liberty movement and maybe also in the Reformed Liberty movement, as it were?
Sure. I guess I'll go first. So I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've been a libertarian since 2008. Yeah, 2008, with the Ron Paul revolution. I am the proprietor of the website mereliberty.com. And as you mentioned, my podcast, Dare to Think. My work really focuses on currently a libertarian theory of reproductive rights. And of course, that relates to abortion. I'm probably best known for my debate at the Soho Forum with Walter Block, where I narrowly lost by a statistical dead heat. But I also do work with the Libertarian Christian Institute, and co-authored a book with them called Faith Seeking Freedom, Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions. And it was LCI that got us started with the Reformed Libertarians podcast. I've been Reformed since, 2012-ish. So at any rate, Gregory and I have known each other for about 6 years, and it was a logical fit for him and I to do the Reformed Libertarians podcast.
And that's only about a few months old, correct?
Yeah, we launched in November, so it's still very young.
Very good, very good. And Gregory, if you wouldn't mind, tell us just a little bit about yourself and your background.
I'm living in the Susquehanna Valley of Pennsylvania. That's kind of central-ish PA. Some people call it Pennsyltucky. Got a lot of Amish around, that kind of thing. You can imagine that. It's the ridge and valley of the Appalachians. So very idyllic farmland between hills.
Sure.
And but I was born and raised in Baltimore. I'm more of a city guy. Spent most of my years in or around urban areas. Spent a number of years teaching English overseas. So I was in a number of different countries in Asia and then in Europe. I'm somewhat of a lifetime student. I didn't intend for that to be the way things went, but I'm doing it now. I'm back at my master's degree in philosophy, working on a thesis, and I'm waiting tables and trying to do other semi-academic kind of work on the side. I became a libertarian anarchist in 2008. Before then, I had sort of been a constitutionalist, and it's mostly through the influence of people associated with the Mises Institute, Rothbard and Roderick Long, Jared Casey, guys like that.
Right.
What else can I tell you?
Yeah, very cool.
I've been,
no, that's great.
I was born and raised in the Reformed faith. My parents became Christians in their sort of their college years and met in a church and married. And I was raised in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. That's a very small, confessional, sort of old school Presbyterian denomination.
Right.
And it's probably in my early high school years that I became more conscientiously sort of theologically minded and explicitly reformed in my convictions. Did a lot of theology reading, that kind of thing.
And so when we talk about Reformed, for all of our viewers, listeners, and whatnot, is that pretty much exclusively Calvinist in nature? I mean, can that be boiled down to Calvinism? And is it mostly Presbyterianism in terms of churches that one might attend now here in the U.S.?
Yeah, Calvinism is sort of a nickname that Reformed churches took on. You could say it began following the Lutheran Reformation, began in places like Switzerland with Ulrich Zwingli, and he was the same generation as Luther. A number of other guys in that same generation who ended up sort of coalescing together, separate from the Lutherans. And of course, there were some other groups that didn't end up in this Reformed category, the Anabaptists, for example. But during the time of the Reformation, all the churches that ended up identifying as Reformed, including in Scotland, that Reformed church took the name somewhat distinctively as Presbyterian. So Presbyterians are part of the broader Reformed movement. And I would say what sets off Presbyterians in the British Isles was the fact that it was sort of a linguistic, cultural, geographical designation. So you have your French Reformed, your German Reformed, your Swiss Reformed, your Hungarian Reformed, and the English and Scottish and Irish were Presbyterians. They were the Reformed.
Presbyterian. Okay, very cool. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. So let's dive right in. How does that tie in then to? I love the name. It's very interesting to me. Reformed Libertarians, the new podcast. It sounds like certainly there's going to be a hook there tying back into your faith. And maybe there's a bit of a double entendre there as well. So tell us about the podcast and about how you came up with the name and what are the themes of that podcast?
Well, not to dominate this part of the conversation, Kerry, you jump in when I leave something out. But so the name Reformed Libertarians is intended to refer directly to the kind of Christians we are. So we are Reformed Christians. We are libertarian anarchists, but instead of saying the Reformed Christian Libertarian Anarchist podcast, we thought it would, be simpler to say Reformed Libertarians. And if that has a accidental connotation for we are bringing a different perspective on libertarianism, well, we are doing that. But I mean, if it also sounds like we're somehow reforming libertarianism, that's okay.
Right.
But it really refers to our religious convictions and the perspective from which we understand libertarianism. So, real briefly, if we agree on what libertarianism is with all other libertarians, namely commitment to self-ownership, property rights, and the obligation that flows out of that being the non-aggression principle, to not initiate coercion against other persons or property. So that's how we define libertarianism. And
Sure.
that can really be understood in terms of any number of different, you could say, worldviews or philosophical convictions about the nature of the universe or whatever.
Right.
So someone conceivably could be a libertarian, I don't know, for maybe it just sounds good to them or something. I don't know, whatever,
Sure.
some sort of unreflected reason. But as Reformed Christians, we understand those commitments to be rooted in our most basic understanding of and commitment to beliefs about God and the universe and salvation and so on.
And so I think the term Christian anarchist, for some listeners, that might be like, whoa, what's that all about? But of course, I've kind of talked about some of those themes in previous podcasts. But of course, there's really no contradiction there at all. I think the three of us would certainly agree with that. Anarchism is not just meant to be left-wing bomb throwing or terrorism on the streets or chaos. Certainly, I think we would agree that it's really meant to be, for most practitioners or adherents, they would want the opposite of chaos and terror and oppression. But Christian anarchism definitely has a very interesting ring. Let me ask both of you. Maybe I'll throw it to Kerry. Even from the definition of libertarianism that Gregory offered, and I tend to agree with, can there be libertarian anarchists or anarcho-syndicalists who, unlike the three of us, don't believe in private property rights?
Well, I would say that what libertarianism tolerates is voluntary communities. So if a group of people who want to, share their property, as long as force isn't being used, that's something that libertarianism tolerates. In other words, there's no explicit prohibition that people voluntarily get together and operate on the principle that they don't own any of their property, or that they own some parts of their property and not others. I think Roderick Long offers some interesting arguments about common property that I think are in line with Rothbard's view of private property. But yeah, I don't think I think it tolerates it. It tolerates it in a way that anarcho-communism wouldn't tolerate anarcho-capitalism. So yeah, I think I don't want to use this word superior, but maybe it's superior.
Yeah. Well, that's what it's always kind of struck me. Anarcho-capitalism seems to be the most liberty-based kind of system, or I don't want to say system, but strain of anarchism. And I know there'd be a lot on the far left who would disagree with that. They'd say that, private property ownership is oppression, and you're slaves, you're wage slaves. But of course, anarchism or anarcho-capitalism, if you use that term, it would certainly allow for these voluntary associations, as you were alluding to. So if people want to peacefully enter a covenant community where they share property and they all work in a factory that they all equally own, I think that would be fine under an anarcho-capitalist system, without sounding too much like a utopian myself, talking about this system.
I like to point to Rose Wilder Lane's, I don't think it's The Discovery of Freedom, but it might be. There's another one that she, another little book that she wrote. And in it, she describes her experience in the Soviet Union she was talking to a family who were Christian and basically communist, but they were much more of an anarchist strain, although they probably wouldn't have described themselves as anarchist, but they were absolutely opposed to the state communism because that was trying to control their lives in a way that not only was invading their own life, but it didn't work. Now she points out in that narrative that they had a functioning society. It was not technologically advanced, so I think you would find that in more anarcho-communist or anarcho-socialist communities. They wouldn't be technologically advanced. And you know, if people are okay living like that, then they should be free to live like that. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that it's distinct from state communism.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And true communism, I guess theoretical communism, it would be a stateless society, right, where they've already worked through the socialist phase of history onto the kind of end of history, you know, which would be the stateless paradise for the workers. That's sort of
their end goal, but they feel like they can use the state to achieve that, and that's of course why they keep failing.
Right. Yeah. The dialectic always kind of teeters on that one side of state oppression somehow.
Right. Yeah.
So talk to me more, maybe Gregory and or Kerry, about the link between Christianity and liberty. And of course, as Christians, let me toss out something that's often discussed, and I think you've discussed it maybe in some of your work, Romans chapter 13, which of course is always kind of thrown back in the face of libertarians or anarchists who happen to be Christian. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities and so forth. And so how do you square your Christian beliefs with Romans chapter 13 and libertarianism or even anarchism?
This is Gregory's favorite chapter.
Awesome.
This is my favorite chapter. Well, I had forgotten to say that, give a sort of summary about what our podcast is doing. We have a little mission statement, so to speak. We aim to educate and inspire our listeners to embrace and promote a view of libertarianism as grounded in the Reformed faith and informed by a Reformed worldview. So it's about, so we're educating, inspiring, hoping that people will come to embrace and promote libertarianism from this perspective that our podcast is about in terms of explaining. One of the things we start out explaining, we have a sort of a basic introduction, basic introduction in episode 1. And in episode 2, we jump right into Romans 13. So go listen to that, reformedlibertarians.com. And we have our episodes listed. After that, you can do like a / and then 002. It'll bring you to that episode. And what we try to explain there is that perhaps the default view of Romans 13 is one that is at odds with a historical and, we say, confessionally Reformed perspective. Confessionally just means in the Reformed churches, we have a statement of faith that sort of lays out what Reformed churches believe. Basically, it's a statement of what they think the Bible teaches. So these are known as confessions. They can also be understood in terms of creeds. Maybe people have heard that word. For example, the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. These are statements of Christian faith. And so in the Reformed churches, we have these statements of our belief, what we believe the Bible to teach. And in those confessions, they touch on what the Bible teaches about civil governance, particularly with reference to Romans 13. And the understanding there is that when that passage refers to what God has ordained, that this is not, it may sound like it's referring to, in the first two verses, or the first verse or the first and second verses, it may sound like it's referring to, the term could be just de facto rulers, whoever happens to be existing, claiming power. It sounds like maybe that's what it's referring to. But as the other verses go on, you can recognize very clearly that what God is ordaining is a particular office. And by that we mean, you could think of it in terms of like a job description. So God is saying he invented this job description among human beings to administer civil justice, to punish civil wrongdoing, and to defend anyone who might be a victim of that wrongdoing. So that's the kind of job that God has put into human society for humans to conduct themselves in this way, to use coercion only responsively in order to bring about restitution by aggressors to their victims, and not to do all the other things we see government doing, not to oppress people, not to use aggression, not to initiate coercion against anybody.
Yes.
So that's
not to run every facet of their lives.
That's right. That's right. And so that's actually the description in Romans 13, to which in the first 7 verses, that's like the sub part of the chapter, to which God calls people to submit. It means cooperate with the administration of civil justice. And that's all that it calls for. So this definitely runs against some typical understandings of the passage, any given, maybe at least evangelical church. And of course, we distinguish ourselves from evangelicals. But, you know, you might hear, well, you got to do what the government tells you. And, you know, the Bible says you got to submit. And, you know, they might make the exception for, you know, unless they tell you to sin or something like that. But we don't think that's, right. We don't think that's how the passage goes. The passage is only calling for people to cooperate with actual justice, actual civil justice. And that's it.
Sure.
So,
and of course, Paul, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, and as we all know, Paul wrote this 1950, you know, almost 2,000 years ago, pre-state, right? Before there was this idea of a state. Now, of course, there was the Roman Empire, or there was this, you know, ancient world empire, but the state as it is now, that does coerce us and enters every part of our lives and tells us to do this and tells us what medicine to get or what we can discuss with our doctor, and on and on and on. None of that existed. And I think it would be an alien concept, even for those living under quasi-persecution of the Romans, perhaps. Go ahead. They were familiar with a kind of tyranny that perhaps was more overt, in the sense of, here is Caesar, who identifies as a deity or a quasi-deity, and he's requiring people to offer, you know, sacrifices, incense, prayers, some sort of tacit, you know, acknowledgement of his deity. And of course, famously, before the Messiah came, the Jews had all sorts of problems with that. And in the, you know, following the coming of the Messiah, the Christians couldn't go along with that. So
But all of this might raise the question, as you had asked, how then can we understand, what is the Christian understanding of liberty that plays into this? And really, it's very intimately tied with that idea of civil justice. It might be helpful to offer this distinction, which is an important one, between morality in a narrow sense and civil justice in a different sense. So morality in general, as it's defined by God's abiding moral will, can be summed up in terms of love, right? So Christ said the two greatest commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like unto it: love your neighbor as yourself. In all these things, the law and the prophets are summarized. So the morality is to have that kind of goodwill, willing what's best for others, that benevolence of doing good, not wanting to bring harm or whatever to other people, actively being charitable, et cetera, et cetera. So that's roughly how we can understand morality, and the violation of that can be understood in terms of sin or perhaps even vice, something along those lines. If I have unbenevolent, if I have malevolent feelings towards you, if I'm envious towards you, if I, hope that you fail, if I, lie to you, if I'm deceitful in my dealings with you, and whatever the case may be, is something that's, interact with you in an unloving way. If I'm not going out of my way to help you when you need help, right? That's sort of unloving. That's vice. That we can understand that in terms of sin. Now, civil justice is something distinct from that. And that is to give each person their due, right? What they're owed, our duty, right? So what people own is theirs, and I should give that to them. That's what I owe them. That's my duty, to give them what's due to them. That's the understanding of justice. And that might not be, mercy or charity, right? Like if there's a beggar on the street and he's saying, hey, can you help a guy out? A couple bucks, some change or whatever. Well, that's not owed, right? That's not his property. The $1.50 in my pocket is not his property that I owe to him, that it's my duty to give to him. If it was, that would be justice. If I owe it to him, then that's justice. But if I don't, and giving it to him is helpful towards him, that is love. Okay, so there's a concrete example where we can see the distinction between what we owe somebody. If I borrow $1.50 from you with the promise of its return, then giving you that $1.50 would be justice. But if you're just asking for it as a favor, that's love. So that's an important distinction. Yes. Now, so that's a Christian. Now, other people have recognized that, right? So Christians aren't the only ones who recognize sort of the love character of morality, the what is due character of justice. This is because God has created the universe this way. Even unbelievers, even non-Christians can sort of recognize these things, recognize that distinction. But the particular understanding that God made the world that way, that he wills love and justice for human beings, that he's calling them to that. This is sort of a normative obligation. We have a particular Christian biblical understanding of how those things are defined. And one thing that justice involves is to not aggress. That's what I owe to my neighbor in terms of civil justice, that his person and his property, or his or her person or property, I'm not to initiate coercion against. And the only rightful use of coercion is in response to any prior aggression on their part. So the only way I could ever use violence legitimately is, say, in self-defense, or in defense of someone else, or in defense of rightful property. And that is the liberty that people are owed. They are owed the liberty of not being aggressed against civilly. So this whole understanding of love, what love is, what justice is, how they're distinct, how liberty ties in with civil justice, that's some Reformed ethics, political ethics 101. And and how we relate that to our understanding of political philosophy, so to speak, and our understanding of, the way people should interact together in terms of the question of the use of coercion in society and respecting other people's property and how we're to cooperate and that kind of thing. We're trying to lay out these very basic concepts and distinctions and explain them in terms of our libertarian perspective in the podcast. And there's a whole lot of things that relate to that we're trying to bring into the picture piece by piece and give people, as solid a foundation as we can, hopefully without being too egg-headed about it or too technical or boring or lecture-y. But I feel like I took maybe 10 minutes to answer your question. So.
No, I appreciate the thorough answer. I mean, I like the egg-headed stuff too. Okay. we need to think through, why it is we believe what we believe.
The liberty movement needs
Kerry,
a few
touching
eggheads.
upon. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we can't all just be bomb throwers.
Right.
But Kerry, let me to kind of piggyback or to continue that discussion. We had mentioned Romans chapter 13. To me, to someone like me, and maybe to a lot of other fellow Christians and lots of people in society, it seems like we're living through Romans chapter 1 right now, as I see some of the debauchery that's happening throughout our society. And I see cycles in history and whatnot. I know this has all been seen in the Bible before. Humanity has seen this kind of thing before, but people tend to I think conflate too often libertarianism with libertinism. And speaking from a Christian perspective, can you address that? Do libertarians need to embrace novel or radical or avant-garde lifestyles? Is that a necessity? Must a libertarian celebrate libertinism? And what's kind of the difference there? I know you've spoken about that before and addressed that.
Yeah, so the short answer is no. And actually, libertinism is the idea that you don't have morals to follow. You don't have to follow that don't steal rule because that's somebody else's rule and you don't hold to that rule. I'm of the opinion, I don't know what Gregory thinks of this, but I'm of the opinion that you can't be libertarian and libertine because it would require the libertine to recognize the non-aggression principle. And that is, even though that's a legal principle, if you violate that legal principle, there is a an immoral element to violating that principle. So I don't actually think that you can be libertarian and libertine.
I won't tell the Reason magazine, folks. Sorry. Right?
Well, you could you could hold to
Sorry,
the
Dave.
non-aggression principle, and
Yes.
I guess be, immoral, or let's say lax with regard to your morals as understood in a Christian sense, and then we would
Sure.
call those people libertine, but they would still be libertarians.
Sure.
You couldn't be a
So,
total moral relativist. That's true.
Yeah.
It would be tough.
Yeah.
It would
Yeah.
be tough.
I think, though, the question often comes up surrounding issues like drug use, abortion, prostitution. There's almost a caricature about libertarians that all we are pot smoking. What is it? Pot smoking. I'm forgetting it now. Pot smoking, abortion loving. Going out and having free sex, stuff like that. And, that criticism comes from this idea that libertarians aren't moral people. They don't have a moral compass. They want a live and let live society. They don't want people telling them what to do. The non-aggression principle is useful in saying, okay, we're going to, or what we believe is that civil governance is strictly limited to adjudicating, or getting restitution for acts of aggression, and acts of aggression are prohibited. And so that rules out a number of things, in my opinion, and Gregory agrees, that rules out abortion as being something that can be legally allowed in a libertarian society. Now, how we go about dealing with abortion prohibition is another question entirely. I don't think that a libertarian view of abortion prohibition looks anything like the conservative or Republican conception of abortion prohibition. I think it looks very different. So, that's a brief answer to that. When it comes to things like drug use and prostitution, those we would categorize as vices. We would say they're immoral, but they aren't initiating aggression against anybody else. And of course, if a drug user or a drug dealer were to initiate aggression against somebody else in their practice of drug use, of course there's a law broken there. That's a violation of the non-aggression principle, but it's not the drug use itself. Same thing with prostitution. And I just did an episode. Actually, I did a longer episode with the Libertarian Christian podcast on decriminalizing sex work, and did a sort of offshoot of that with my own podcast. Dare to Think, that episode just came out this past Monday. But the issue with prostitution is, again, if a woman or a man is voluntarily participating in that, they aren't initiating violence against anybody, that just means that that's a problem not to be solved by civil government. It doesn't mean it's not a problem. It just means that doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of civil governance. That is not something that we would use violence against in order to get them to stop. And one of the points that is raised in that episode about decriminalizing sex work is that when you introduce violence into that sort of situation where you're dealing with vice, it creates all new problems and all new injustices. And so, as Christians, we can say prostitution is immoral, drug use is immoral, but is it really the role of civil government to create injustice in the pursuit of getting them to stop their vices? And we would, of course, say no. But that doesn't mean that we can't use nonviolent means through the market to try and help people not do those things anymore.
Yeah, and to get the state involved, I mean, I like all those thoughts, really interesting stuff. When we put the state in between these relationships or alleged crimes or these vices, then they're basically erasing the chance for any organic civil society to take root in their tradition, whether it's Christianity or what have you, Judaism, whatever it might be. And I know in Catholicism and other branches of Christianity, there is this concept of subsidiarity. And just because we don't let Washington, D.C., basically adjudicate prostitution, these crimes, alleged crimes or what have you, or for me, Sacramento or your state capital in whatever state you live, just because we don't let some far off so-called authority step in and get involved, it doesn't mean that the parents, the family, the neighborhood, or the church community will not kind of adjudicate or offer some kind of justice, restorative justice or otherwise. And that's the way that I see it. It almost like astroturfs the whole thing. It homogenizes so-called society. And then we don't let civil society or churches or neighborhoods and families do their job at the lower level.
Yeah. Well, let me give you an example with prostitution really quick, because in my interview with Melissa Brudeau, one of the things that she points out is that so there's sort of this move now to decriminalize the sale of sex, so on the part of the woman, but to criminalize and penalize the purchase of sex, so the demand. And this is called the Nordic model. And what they've found is that, she cited a study in Ireland where they have this model. And the goal was to get men to stop purchasing sex, to create a deterrence, right? You're going to be penalized if you're caught purchasing sex, so don't do it. That's the legal principle there. And so what they actually found was that the demand for prostitution did not go down. It stayed the same. But it incentivized an increase in antisocial behavior, which was just, okay, how do I not get caught? And that antisocial behavior contributes to the problem of abuse. And so, and those women who were dependent upon that money from prostitution, they can't go get regular jobs because of stigma. The only way that they can survive is to lower the cost. Well, this is simple supply and demand principles here. You lower the cost and you encourage antisocial behavior. What are you going to get? A recipe for disaster. And the very women that you're trying to help out of that situation are going to be harmed more. So, that's not one, it's not justice. Two, it's not rescuing anybody out of that situation. It's not helping those women get out of that situation, which is sort of the ultimate goal of the Nordic model. But it doesn't help at all. And so we should really be asking the question, okay, if the purpose of civil justice is to actually bring justice to situations, what do we say when those actions are creating injustice? So, Gregory, I think you were going to say something.
Well, Greg had mentioned subsidiarity, and I was going to jump on that topic a little bit, if you don't mind. Brings to mind the idea, and I'm going to botch the quote because I don't remember it exactly. Your listeners are probably familiar with it. Friedrich Bastiat from The Law, or maybe some other essay, where he says, we talk about not wanting the state or the government to do X, Y, and Z. And people hear us, they think that means we don't want X, Y, and Z to be done. And that's not what we're saying. So he's, even, back then, he's at pains to try to explain his position that, look, I'm not saying functioning well-functioning societies don't need X, Y, and Z to be done. So think of anything you think the government is doing that is really necessary for a society to have. Chances are, we might agree with you. All these things need to be done. We just don't think any of them should be done by coercive means.
Mm-hmm.
It's so hard to get people to recognize. We're saying yes, a society needs all these things to be done, but none of them, if they're not a matter of initiating coercion, they can't be responded to in terms of coercion. That's wrong. So, the Reformed worldview or tradition has a parallel sort of social teaching to that of subsidiarity, and it's called sphere sovereignty, which may seem a little weird. Mm-hmm. But it basically means sphere refers to a kind of community, right? So besides, let's say, civil governance institutions, there are other kinds of communities in society. And you can think of those in terms of the basic institutions of churches and marriages and families and
de Tocqueville mentioned all these. Yeah,
that's right. So they've gone by a host of different characterizations what all these distinct kinds of communities are in human societal life, and what the concept of sphere sovereignty tries to emphasize is that each of these has its own unique character, and you could think about it, its own jurisdiction, right? Its own delegated responsibility for certain kinds of societal organization, certain kinds of societal life together, the things that they're responsible for taking care of. And civil governance should be strictly limited to administering civil justice. And then let's say we have a host of quote unquote social problems, economic problems, however you want to characterize them, moral problems. Okay, those can all be dealt with through these other communal means, right? So society itself is not a single thing. It's not one unit with, in a pyramid form with the state at the top. That's not the image you want in your mind. What you want is a whole bunch of sort of concentric or overlapping circles, as it were, or interpenetrating spheres or something, where they're cooperating together according to their own principles of self-governance, and they can together, and it's really through what we would call spontaneous order, right? It's not managed through central planning. This kind of harmonization, societal harmonization, is emergent. It comes out of a kind of normative operation, not centrally coordinated. Independent coordination. And so, right, if the state or whatever civil governance there is leaves their hands off economic exchanges and the means of those exchanges and so on and so forth, whatever's not a matter of coercion, society has its ways of working those things out. Social, moral problems, those can all be dealt with through non-coercive means. And we're going to find, surprise, surprise, that's the best way. That's the best alternative we have to deal with those problems.
Yeah.
That's and it's amazing because it almost seems like things have been co-opted or turned on their head with so much of the authoritarian left, as I'm going to characterize it, just taking over all of these spheres that you had mentioned and that we've been discussing. Perhaps, and I'm not conflating all of the left with atheism. But perhaps when you make the state your God, or when you get away from any mention of a God, or normative or objective morality, normative rules, perhaps then you get this creeping totalitarianism where, call it social justice, and it leads to cancel culture and this totalitarian everything within the state, Twitter working for the state, Facebook working for the state, censoring people who say things that are rude or saying things that are, quote, misinformation. Maybe that's what we're seeing a little bit of right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're getting this total takeover of these spheres, which used to not be the playground or the jurisdiction of the state.
Yeah.
Well, and it's very easy to think that the source of law and order is the state. And I remember an interview, I think it was with Lee Schooland, about her experience in communist China under Mao. And
I tear
Mao
up
had
whenever
this
she
belief.
talks. It's so incredible. She's got great stories.
I love her. She does. But she said that Mao had this belief that God created a chaotic world and that it was the job of the state to bring order to it. And I think it's very interesting because if you talk to some Christians who hold what Gregory called the default view of Romans 13, they're basically saying the same thing, that God created chaos and that it's our job to create order. And more specifically, it's the state's job to create order. And when you have that mentality, it's very easy then for the state to creep in and monopolize all the spheres of society, because all the spheres of society are, in their view, inherently chaotic and needs to be brought under the control and order of the state. And so, yeah, I think that's, I think it's
to nuance that
slow, but it's, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, to nuance that in a little bit further, they might say, well, no, we don't think, God created a chaotic world, but, we're fallen, we're sinful people and depraved. So we have to have, authority. And for them, that translates into basically an authoritarian, totalitarian vision. Someone's in charge of society, some crazy idea like that. And that's leaving out the understanding of what in the Reformed tradition we call common grace, right? So after Adam and Eve sin, God does not immediately bring the final judgment and send them to hell, and that's the end. That's not what happens. We have the introduction of saving grace, but along with saving grace comes what we call a common grace. It's still undeserved and unmerited favor from God, so that's why it's grace. It doesn't get anybody into the new heavens and earth paradise at the end of the world, but it doesn't deliver anybody from their sin. But it's the kind of grace that preserves the order of the world that we see explicitly revealed after the flood, right? So things get pretty bad. God brings a kind of final judgment, but preserves Noah and his family. And then afterwards, he makes explicit, the world scene is going to continue. I'm not going to interrupt it so cataclysmically again until the final judgment, at least not through a flood. It's this preservation of the world that we understand as God's common grace. And that's essentially what people are ignoring when they're saying the only way we can have order in society is by having some monopoly in charge, that otherwise things are going to be chaos. They're not going to be chaos without the state. The state is an agent of chaos because of its monopolistic power.
Yes.
It's bringing chaos
and it's almost
everywhere.
question begging, or
Yeah. No,
It's like question begging or circular logic, maybe, to just say, well, if we didn't have the state, there would be chaos. That's how we define chaos.
No,
It's
exactly.
well, hold on there.
Yeah.
Time out.
And one
Kerry,
thing
you
I
were
wanted
say
to
something, or
one thing
go
I
ahead.
wanted to add
Go ahead.
about the religion of the state is that it may have many sort of, there may be many institutions of civil religion, so to speak, but public education, government schools have got to be one of the biggest ones. And, I think our priorities are really end the Fed, end the wars, right? But ending public schools has got to happen if we're going to nullify, decentralize, secession, bring liberty. It's got to happen. So the government school system is one of the most pernicious, demonically conceived systems in any country ever, but definitely in the United States.
And extremely pervasive. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it sounds radical to say what you said, but since we've adopted this Prussian educational model over the past 160 years, 140
that's exactly
years
what
at
it
least.
is.
With Horace Mann and whatnot, it's like lining up kids in rows, teaching them weird factoids that they don't need to. They might never use again, not teaching them how to balance a checkbook or how to start a fire in the woods or, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then putting up little idols, on the wall, these busts of presidents, some of whom might have done a great job, some of whom were awful. But, teaching them in this way, in this form, has been, I think, extremely destructive to actual free thought. And what the type of people, a true education, a classical education that we'd want to be brought into, the young and people who are going to grow up to be citizens of a republic, as it were.
Yeah.
Yep. Totally agree.
Well, there's a lot. This has been a great discussion so far. I feel like we could have round 2 and round 3, but I want to respect all of your time tonight. I feel like we just did a brief survey of some really interesting topics. Lots more to get to, but I really want to thank you both for coming on the podcast, and maybe we'll do this again here in the near future. Really interesting stuff to cover. I think these topics of, if we support liberty as Christians, how do we reconcile that? And it's completely reconcilable, but I think we come from a world, maybe in our country, in our so-called society, where those are almost seem to be at odds, and they are not at odds at all. I think you would agree, and I've heard you say as much in your work. But once again, your podcast is Reformed Libertarians, and then Dare to Think. That's right, Kerry?
Yes. Dare to Think.
Awesome. Yeah, I would encourage everyone to go check this out, because you're going to get really interesting discussions like this, and probably in even more depth. But I really want to thank you both for your time and coming on, and hope to speak with you again soon.
Hey,
Thank
thanks,
you
Greg.
very much for having us.
And if any,
Yeah,
I don't know where the bulk of your listeners are, but if any of them are interested in exploring more about this Reformed Christianity perspective, the perspective that we're coming from and we advocate, and that we want to explain liberty in terms of, if they were to look for, let's say, a church with the name United Reformed Church, URC, so any church that might have that in their name, or Orthodox Presbyterian Church, or maybe Presbyterian Church in America. Let me think, what else are the other churches? Reformed Presbyterian Church. Of course, there's some Korean Presbyterian or Reformed churches, probably on the West Coast.
Interesting.
Any of those churches,
Yeah,
or
most of our listeners are in California.
Yeah, or they can just get in touch with me, tell me where they are, and you can find our contact on our website, reformedlibertarians.com. If they're interested, I'll find something close to them, hopefully.
Cool. Well, I thank you again both for the interesting discussion on these various topics, and there's lots more to cover. But you both have a great day, and I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
This has been the California Liberty Project podcast. Make sure to subscribe, share it with others, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter.